Group 29 in room 64, Group 30 in the cranny. Not the nook, but the cranny. Group 31 and 32, 35 and 36 in the 39 room, and 33 and 34 have made their own arrangements, and so I guess they know what they are. There's at least one or two in every group, isn't there? Since becoming head of the Department of Family Environment, I've been slowly, at least I suspect in the eyes of the staff, gaining a perspective about individuals and families, quite different from my early training. Among the concepts that have been discussed with me are such things as household production, a notion that seems to be receiving some renewed attention. Closely allied is the idea of human resources as an input into the quality of life which transcends the usual bookkeeping of educational attainment, for example. To discuss perhaps these and many other notions which focus on socioeconomic aspects of human beings, we have for this session Dr. Ted Schultz, who is the Charles L. Hutchison Distinguished Service Professor, the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. Dr. Schultz passes both of my criteria for being qualified to speak to the group. They're perhaps irrelevant, but it turns out that he is also, as I, a native of South Dakota. I remember, in fact, the first instructor I had at this institution who asked members of the class where they were from, and when I said South Dakota, he gave me 10 points. The suggestion, I guess, was that anyone who left there deserved some advantage over others. I'm not implying that Dr. Schultz would agree with that assessment at all. Secondly, he was a staff member of this university from 1934, which was a very good year, as Dean Martin says, the year I was born. 30? Well, we can't make it right all the time. 1934 still was a good year. Through 1943, I believe, and he's been involved in a number of publications which you can read on the bibliographic sheet that certainly pertain directly to the topic he's going to discuss with us this morning. So quite beyond the facetious kind of criteria I've mentioned, he has focused a great deal of his attention on the notion of human capital, on the investment in human beings, and thus brings us his thoughts this morning on the family and its human capital. We're very pleased this morning to have him with us, Dr. Ted Schultz.
Well, earlier this morning and up to this moment, I've been engaged in counting my disadvantages in appearing before you. I am not a sociologist. It's rather serious. My roots are not in the Weltanschauung of the University of Vienna. I wish it were. It was South Dakota State College instead. I recently seen Wallace Farmer on Woman's Lib, at least what women in Iowa have been saying about it. I was a little puzzled, but it gives my paper a disadvantage. I'm still too close to Iowa to have real perspective. I started here in 30, not in 34. Do I have to really talk loud? My gosh. Unfortunately, I've written a paper, and that's very bad unless you want to get a copy and read it, which I would advise, even though I shall inflict parts of it on you. There's a great temptation for me to reminisce, simply because of my roots in this particular institution, which are very dear to me. Remember 1930, I came in at a very nice salary, at that time $3,500, and the faculty voted to reduce it 15% the next year. I didn't mind because they reduced the figures, the percentage, as a higher percentage cut for those who were a little higher in salaries, and most of them were, of course. It was one of the real strokes of social consciousness that I've ever known of, at least participated in and known of, in any university. It is a tremendous thing for this campus, the faculty and the administration have done under the crisis situation of 31, and so on. I could go on in this. I think there were a number of things done on this campus in a consensus sense that were just extraordinary. It would be something as if you or the students here would vote themselves a 35% increase in tuition to have been effective this fall, just to face the fact that there is a worry and a concern of another sort, in the other direction in this case, about matters of the cost of who's paying the cost of higher education these days. One could go on. I'm very proud of that particular experience, although I'm sure when I came home and announced it, it wasn't quite received in the same fine fashion. I was privileged to teach in home economics. And of course, there's supposed to be a little economics. It kind of cut me out after a bit, and other reasons. I became aware of the distinguishing pioneering work that had started here before my day. Hazel Kirk, extraordinary figure, the distinguished Elizabeth Hoyt, and the extraordinary women, Margaret Reed, Mary Jean Bowman, Miss Wyckoff, Ida Graves, were all in the picture at that time, and others. Also in the state, in extension, because a third of my salary after the second or third year was paid from extension as things turned out. Now, contrary to folklore, I really did not insist that I earned my academic bread without butter, as the argument or folklore sometimes go. Now, my paper has benefited, I've profited from several very competent critics. I've taken seriously a number that Mr. Hoyt has conveyed to me in her very capable fashion. One critic, however, was very worried that I was sneaking up too close to women's lib and lectured me on this point. And then I wondered what that is. You see, I really began to ask myself, I think surely it is someone, there's a woman who's in the woman's lib, someone you dislike because she is saying publicly what you have been thinking for a long time privately. I think that's the definition I would want to use and escape my dilemma here this morning in this respect. I've changed my title. My title is really the Woman's New Economic Commandments, and it encompasses a bit more than the thrust of human capital, which has been my area of research in a very considerable extent for some years. It's a hard paper to defend and to present simply because I have been trying to break some new ground for myself, because for upwards of a decade now there have been so many puzzles arising about the rewards that come to women from, let's say, the large amount of schooling they have, which you can't get a hold of in data and statistics as we look at the earnings of males, for example. But I could go on in terms of these puzzles, but the title will nevertheless seem a burden or puzzle you in itself, a woman's commandments, economic commandments. And I'm reminded of the distinguished Professor Wheeler, a biologist who was asked to address a conference on that very nice title, Academic Dry Rot. And being a biologist, he just wondered where that would end up in the library. And in Widener Library at Harvard, it was in fact filed under fungi. I don't know whether there's a religious department in most libraries under which you can put commandments, but I know where it's going to end up, you see, under Judo-Christianity dialogue, recent vintage commandments. Well, there are voices of many women who are demanding a better deal. The rhetoric, I think, is shrill and sometimes swamped with sex, but I think it's short-sighted to not see that there are really some basic underlying developments in Western societies, and particularly in ours, that do call for adjustments. Now, I'm going to pick out and concentrate on those developments which are economic in nature. I may sound like an economic imperialist because I think they're very important and powerful in changing all kinds of institutions in our lives. The mere fact that we are really very, very rich. We're living absolutely unbelievably far above subsistence, a kind of which has never existed in the world again for nearly all of us in our society. But if you get closer to women in this context, the economist is aware of a simple fact, which he shouldn't make too much of, that in the gross, just take all females and all males, females actually control privately a bit more of property, of the total private property in the United States, than males do. Hard physical work is no longer available to women. You'll revolt at this, but it's true, increasingly, certainly in the days of my mother and women growing up just one generation back and now. But so they join their husbands camping to satisfy their taste for ruggedness. There's a lot of this occurring, I think. Now, there's an awful lot, an increasing amount of what I call human capital embodied in women, which is adding to their skills, to their changes their taste, and it enhances their productivity, both in the home and as they enter the labor market, those that do. Now, above all, the value of the time of women has been rising, absolutely, and rising more rapidly than males. And this is a very important characteristic that's underway, and it's the most important point that I want to make in the end, in terms of a trend that is powerful and has real force underneath. Now, there are all sorts of lags in the adjustment process. It comes from these conditions and developments underneath. And the opportunities open to women are not in equilibrium with the possibilities. And there are reasons to be concerned. There are reasons even to protest. The bargaining position for a better deal on the part of women should therefore not be underrated. It is strong, and I shall argue it is growing. It is supported by very strong economic developments. Now, I shall hold to the thesis here this morning that home economics, in general, has not quite succeeded in staying abreast of these fundamental developments, despite the extraordinary work that has occurred in some aspects of family economics, and especially at this institution with a long history, taking names like Hazel Kirk as I did, and Elizabeth Hoyt, and into Margaret Liston. But let me be specific what I mean by this. It's one, that the formation of human capital is, I think, still very much neglected. For example, in terms of years of education, the average female is on a par with the average male in our national statistics. And not as many go through higher education, but more go relative than males to high school. And so that actually, if you look at the national figures that mean years of school completed, the female has slightly more, actually, than males. The record of the female in school is distinctly better than that of males. That's in the picture. The health of women has become better. Again, has risen relative to that of males. And particularly if you judge by the rise in life expectancies of women and the difference between that and of males. And think of that now in health terms. This is a fairly recent change. It's very marked, as I think you all know. Now, too, although the value of the time of women has been rising more rapidly than that of men, nowhere, to the best of my knowledge, is this very significant change, development explained, and its implication analyzed. And I should have thought it'd be a very critical part of thinking in home economics in the context. I think it implies that traditional marriage arrangements, family organization, traditional household decision-making are all to some extent becoming obsolete in view of the rising value of the woman's time. Now, 3, the microeconomics of the household in the allocation of the woman's time, how she uses her time and in acquiring and processing commodities that enhance consumption of the family, and the formation of human capital in her children, it seems to me is very much neglected in economics generally and also in home economics in particular. Now, 4th and last of my being specific, the economics of the labor market for women as workers, and it is yet poor accommodations of this market to the special requirements of women is also receiving, I think, too little attention, although there's some very fine work in this area in general economics, home economics as such. It's one of the 3 that I think perhaps is in better state than the others that I've mentioned. Now, therefore we have, as I've noted, protest. There are better opportunities than are being realized, and delays are lags in legal and social and economic adjustments and arrangements. There's a lot of confusion about these. There's a lot of rhetoric as such. I don't quite see them revealing power as we were told, but it's a good way of thinking about it. I think the confusion is that it reaches for panacea, and then I don't think it becomes legitimate, and the influence it might have is actually dulled by not seeing the problem in its more deep and proper perspective. This would be my worry and my if the rhetoric is, it often sounds to me as belaboring the thesis that women should become like men or should be transformed into men, then God forbid. The real adjustments do not really pertain to sex. They relate to a very wide array of rather mundane and very complex issues, and I want to belabor or at least try to reveal some of the economic issues in this context. Now, my way of doing this morning is to first burden you, I guess, with 4 extensions in economic theory that, at least to the economists, I think are all important in getting some new insights in the area, the economic domain of women is where these insights are needed, and it seems to me we're still just getting going, although I will sound a little later as if we have a good deal of evidence that already tells us some things. Now, on the extensions of theory, I'm not going to belabor one that has really been very much advanced by a former member of this faculty, Margaret Reed, which has become the integral part of the permanent income hypothesis, which is associated with the later theoretical work of Milton Friedman. This really grew out of her work. I remember the first time the paper was going around here, and then later too, comparing Wisconsin and Nebraska farmers, each getting, say, $5,000 income, if you want to take that figure, and the Wisconsin farmers saving a much larger proportion of it than the other way around, than the Nebraska farmers. The Nebraska farmers were saving a much larger proportion of that 5,000 than the Wisconsin. And Margaret Reed began to see that this was because the Nebraska farmer had much more transitory income in his figures, in those figures that we saw, and kept puzzling about it. And she was on something very, very fundamental. It's now become a very integral part of economic theory, and extremely significant. Now, the parts that I want to call your attention to are 4, as I've said. One is the concept of human capital. I've had a small hand in this. The paper calls attention to the basic papers in this sense. It has opened the door for empirical analysis dealing predominantly with schooling and education. The empirical work has been largely on men, on males, not on females. Investment on-the-job training, migration, and the same thing can be said here in terms of being restricted. You'd almost think that human capital was sex-specific, that it didn't really get and belong to females. My paper has a very clear statement of the importance of the concept in economics and how it has changed the thrust, and particularly the integration of understanding a complex phenomenon that just escaped us before. A summary that comes out of a recent, very concise statement on this by Professor Harry Johnson. But since it's rather technical and difficult, I think I will not read it, but its implications I think will become clear to you in terms of things I say on the way. Now, the second extension in theory came in '65 in a classic paper by Gary Becker, seeing the pervasiveness of earnings foregone, which we were getting in the schooling and education story, higher education especially, and then generalizing and seeing how important the allocation of time was, and particularly in societies where the value of time has gone so high, and the great differences in the value of time among us. Now, it is especially germane to the value of time for women. In fact, it is more powerful in opening new doors into the non-market activities where we allocate our time to producing satisfactions and things that we want, which is essentially, in large part, what does occur in the household. Here I think I shall read one brief paragraph, which is again concise and clear. This is from Harry Johnson also. This new development in economic analysis is the treatment of time as a fundamental unit of cost in individual allocative decisions with respect to both labor and consumption. Underline consumption in your minds. This concept is to be distinguished sharply from the classical treatment of labor time used up in production as a determinant of economic value, and its usefulness derives from its characteristics in an affluent modern economy in which the typical consumer has a standard of living stratospherically above mere subsistence and is constantly required to choose among competing consumer goods. The central principle of the analysis is that in reality each consumer good has two prices attached to it, a money price, as in traditional theory of consumer choice, and a time cost of acquiring and consuming the commodity. And what has come to the surface now by this extension is carrying the analysis and seeing the importance of the value of the time, and this is largely the woman, that is allocated as in addition to the price that is paid, you see, for the goods one acquires or services one acquires in this whole context. I think this will also become a bit clear when I turn to what may be applications or issues as I come to the last part of the two parts of my paper. Now, the new economics of the household is the third extension. This is the economic analysis of the value of time as a unit of cost in the production activities of the household, has rapidly led to this development of a kind of a new economics of the household, and it provides a comprehensive economic approach to non-market household activities in introducing really a meaningful shadow price that women of the time that women devote to these non-market activities to which I've been alluding. Now, home economists have long known that the classical theory of consumer choice pertained to only a part of the allocative decisions in the household. They had identified many production activities that took place in the household, which also required allocative decisions. Margaret Reed already in 1934, in her book, dealt exhaustively with these household production activities. As noted, the new extension in theory reveals now that each consumer good, as I've said, that has attached to it this money price, as traditional consumer theory or choice has held, but then in addition this time cost of acquiring, processing, and literally actually consuming what goes on, the commodity, good, service. Now the fourth extension and last is the economics of information. Now complete and perfect information making allocated decisions has long been a very convenient assumption in general economic theory. We paid a very high price for it in not really opening up and thinking through what goes on in acquiring information. And what this extension, which comes really in a paper in 1961 by George Stigler, who was also here on the faculty at that time, and we voted down our salaries, I guess it was, and so on. I'm sure he voted against it. The point of the extension is that suddenly you see the activity of acquiring information as involving a cost, largely again your time, which you have to equate with what you think you will get by putting in a little more time to get a little more information. And no one drives this beyond the point where he thinks the payoff still is worth pursuing. But it is opening up all across economics a whole new sets of insights, and terribly important what goes on in the household, as some recent research is beginning to reveal. Now, these four new analytical tools, the concept of human capital, the allocation of time, the new economics of the household, and the economics of information, are really what is so challenging in what can now be done and which is getting started, and which I think carries tremendous promise in terms of the very area we're concerned here in your conference and to which I'm trying to address myself. I now turn to a search for some solutions to issues. Here I will appear rather arbitrary as I look at these extensions of theory. I think we get a whole new perspective of marriage, of the household, and of children by treating marriage as a particular type of partnership, and I'm talking about an economic partnership for the moment, the household as a complex economic enterprise requiring both management and entrepreneurship, and children as a source of satisfaction, used to be also security, that entail both pecuniary and non-pecuniary costs. You have to make sacrifices to have these satisfactions. I think this is the key to the population theory if we ever get one. I shall, from this point on, deal exclusively with the domain in which women make decisions, economic decisions, and hold to that in what I'm saying. I shall try to have you envisage that the development that you've been living through the last 2 decades in a dramatic sense, and it's still on, is really a marked, something very profound, real rise in real income. This is the important force which we're trying to live with and acquire values to have satisfaction from it and not make all the mistakes that I think we are still making in trying to live with these new possibilities from a real income side. Now, let me try to cover what I want to say in this last part now under issues, and I shall touch a number of them, as I said, rather arbitrarily in the way I have to assert views and positions that emerge. I shall try to accommodate this slightly with reasoning where I think time permits and I can do it. First is the older single woman. Now, she's typically has had more education than her counterpart in any other country, and by and large also in this country. She's, as a rule, is a skilled person, usually has a job, and lives in an urban environment. She's a member of a growing important class of women. But the rules of the game, in many different ways, discriminate against her. if she's earning a substantial income, if her earnings are substantial, she's acquired some income from property, she's required to pay an unduly high rate of federal income tax. Up until this year, if she was in the 10,000, 12,000 income bracket, a little higher, the rates are over 30% higher than if she was in a joint return with that same income being at the margin added. It's fantastic discrimination. It seems to me to drive a woman either to drink or get married at once. And yet, we're in a population stance where we don't want people, at least give strong incentives for them to get married, and yet here we seem to be doing exactly that in the way this is set. Now, much more serious are other issues, and some of these require analysis far beyond economics. Let me just allude to one, social possibilities and social life. It seems to be strongly oriented by tradition to serve the married person, married people, to the exclusion of the single woman.
The age that I'm describing.
Now, I'll leave this because it seems to me
It's a separate topic.
Full of implications, and we've just begun to touch it in terms of the analytical equipment that I've alluded to. Now, second, the married woman in the labor force. Now, her options of acquiring a job with pay are subject to a number of rather serious restrictions. Regardless of her skill, even if she has won a major graduate degree, the choice of a job is restricted by virtue of her marriage to the location where her husband happens to work. I think that's a fact as we see our world as it's now organized. Being thus tied, the adverse effects upon the incentive she has to specialize in acquiring high level of skills are strong and clear. The adverse effects are very strong. Just suppose the role of the husband and the wife were reversed by the rules of marriage. That is, the woman's job's opportunity would determine where they were located. It would then follow that the incentives required to specialize would also be reversed. This just follows night as from day. I can document this just from my own career with students. You have a young couple coming up. I have the economist. He's an extraordinary guy working for his PhD. He's got a wife getting a PhD in some part of biology. She's highly specialized. They can both get their PhDs. They're equally good. Where can they go that they can get jobs that will fit both of these high skills? Very few places. It happens in urban environments. There are some large urban environments where such a woman can get such a highly specialized position. But if you see this run broadly, the thing that happens is what is alleged in the generalizations I've made. Now, there are adjustments here. You see some of them coming, and I could elaborate on this, but I shouldn't, and I won't take the time. I think they already suggest that there are avenues of adjustment that may make an awful lot of sense. We have this in one couple who are colleagues in our department. They teach, she teaches in our faculty, is on our faculty, and he is elsewhere. Friday we have a party at their home, he's back, and faculty are in, etc. 2 weeks later we'll have another party, and then in between there'll be a party at the other place. They pay the price of travel. It costs a lot, but it's one way of adjusting to maximizing the positions. There are other costs in here that I'm not bringing to the surface at all. Now, another difficulty arises because the labor market, or the woman who's in the labor market, is as yet organized very imperfectly to accommodate the changes in the woman's availability for the job through her married life cycle. Now, a common pattern is to seek a full-time job for a period before having children, then leave the labor force for a decade or longer to care for children, especially if she's highly educated, then after this re-entering the job market. And that the labor market has come a long way, but it is still not organized to this life cycle of supply availability from a point of view and the total circumstances in which the woman normally finds herself. Then too, if she employs someone for taking care of the children if she's away, again we have the tax. Very interesting, and some of you know this, follow it. It is very rough on not being allowed to deduct this unless your income is very, very low. If it's very low, you can deduct it. But as soon as you get your income, even very modestly, the federal government will not allow you to deduct as a cost of earning your income the cost of the person that comes in and takes care of the children or the child while the woman's away. Well, I'm a little harsh here on child care centers. I agree with what is said by Professor Pollock in many ways, but his is more subtle and deeper. Let me just make one assertion. What worries me about the whole thinking about welfare centers, the child care centers, is that we are approaching and thinking of them as welfare agencies. And I think that's fatal. I think that is absolutely the wrong way to start thinking through what is needed here, because we then fail to see that this is an activity that has to be accountable in terms of what it really produces and renders, and what this costs. And that whole part goes by the board, and the failures that we're getting where this is occurring are just beginning to be very, very numerous, where there are others which did get off or still on, where they are not treated as a welfare agency, where there's a deep concern of the people who are involved that they do get something out of this, and they have a sense that it's worth the price that they're paying and what goes into it. So my plea is, as we move towards welfare agencies, it may be a very efficient way to serve some people. Child care centers, we must not look on them as welfare agencies, as I think is so generally the case. Now, the third is to be in charge of the household. The important point here is that the household in the United States, we have in fact now over 60 million units, household units. As the number of farms declines and becomes small, the household is all the more the predominant small, personal, face-to-face, private enterprise of our society. Over 60 million of them. It requires organization, it requires management, and it requires a good deal of entrepreneurship. It's the one small business that we ultimately have left as our farms start disappearing as they have. The decision-making pertaining to this household is borne mainly by the woman. It becomes increasingly complex when it comes to acquiring information about the goods she purchases, allocating her own time, and giving her children a preschool start that paves the way for their future success or investment in schooling. Although the household processes of purchased goods has been vastly altered, in many respects simplified, consumer durables, I have in mind, ready-made goods, it is still a complicated task that requires organization, and let me stress, real, genuine, in terms of what the economist talks about, entrepreneurial abilities. Again, I have to drop at this point, although there are some remarkable studies coming up, a couple of them out of Columbia, Bob Michaels, showing how important in getting a certain amount of consumption out of a given stream of income that rides on the schooling of the mother. It just rises extraordinary with the schooling of the mother. You have the $5,000 or $7,000 or $10,000 stream of income, and different classes of women, age, health, constant, etc., 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 and to see what amount of consumption you get out of a given stream of income, and it simply rises with a general level of the schoolings of the mother. Now, 4 is wanted children. We've become mesmerized by macro population projections featuring countries where the population is appearing to increase at these very rapid rates. Unfortunately, I didn't hear Mrs. Judith last night. I wish I had.
I've taken issue with a number of things that are published in Science, etc. At least one person conveyed to me the view expressed last night, the one that I would probably share to a considerable extent. The Profitable Population Bomb, sold by Paul Ehrlich, is a modern doomsday book, and it's literally filled with fruit flies. It befits the authority of a laboratory biologist, and really doesn't tell you anything about population. It's terribly misleading. It just has no sense of the rationality of human beings. Human beings are not robots. They're not fruit flies. And yet we're getting a lot of this in so-called macropopulation things. This is not to say at all that there aren't serious population problems in the world, but the way the talk goes, the rhetoric, it leads to doomsday on an extraordinarily simplistic treatment of the human being, as I'm alleging. Population projections are really quite meaningless. They really have, I think we ought to learn this by this time, how quickly these things change. Yet we, those who promulgate these projections, don't realize that the Department of Commerce has been changing their 20-year projections 2-3 times within a year. Twice within a year at last in this last 12 months. It just goes on. And then we talk about projecting them for countries of the world for 20 years. And what was said 5 years ago just looks silly today and look much more sillier 5 years from now. We have no population theory in the macro sense simply because we have not thought through a micro theory of the family. And it's got to rest on the behavior at the family level. And then I think you will begin to might get, a broad, general, aggregated macro theory. Now this could come from sociology. I think Professor William Good from Columbia, who's to be on your program, at least I have gained a great deal from some of his writings, which does begin to have in it the beginning foundations of what I call, from a sociological point of view in this case, the micro theory and a major step. The thinking and work of Professor Saul Tax in anthropology and his colleagues, seen a good deal of Saul, was next door, and so on over the years, exemplified in their recent work and publications in anthropology on the Guatemalan Indian communities. Now here's an anthropologist, or a group of anthropologists, and they're really beginning to lay the foundations from the concepts of anthropology, which is a micro-family in a small community sense behavior. Well, the point is that these families are very rational in terms of the social and economic circumstances and conditions under which they live. It's not a random thing. They're not robots. They're not fruit flies, I keep repeating. Now economics is entering, and I think, obviously I'm attracted to it. The empirical analysis of behavior of parents in having and rearing children, the research underway at the National Bureau of Economic Research, including Columbia University in New York, City University of New York, at RAND, and a great deal of it now, it seems to me, almost beginning to dominate some of our best workshops in economics at the University of Chicago. It rises simply out of the advances in theory that I alluded to earlier. And it's again, the value of the woman's time is absolutely the most powerful explanatory factor once you get down to the micro level. If you want to understand the numbers of children, commitment to producing children of quality in the sense that you invest in their schooling and health and education and so on. Well, I want to argue this further. I do set out in the paper the rationale here and indicate what it really implies from an economic point of view. And there is now growing very rapidly a vast literature. In fact, it's so good and so important in my judgment, I've allowed myself to get committed during the next year and a half, 2 years, of running 3 national conferences, bringing these studies to a head, including one on the theory of marriage, an economic theory of marriage, which has a great deal of counterpart into the empirical world. And I find this very exciting in terms of what appears to emerge and is important. Now, I think it's not amiss here to call your attention, as I know some of you have talked privately among yourselves, undoubtedly, but to ponder the reasons for the success of the socialist countries in Eastern Europe, and including USSR, in bringing the fertility rates, especially of the urban population, down. Why did they succeed, or why did the birth rates, the fertility rates, come down so extraordinary? A third of this paper was written in Romania this summer, so I was close at hand. Romania is a very special case. Another third was written in Zurich. A third was written before I went. So if it sounds incoherent, its birthplace, I think, will have to bear some of the burden. Going beyond the United States, now let me say one more thing about the Russian picture here. And it's a question, really. Could it be that this rapid decline in fertility rates in these countries has been accomplished unwittingly by bringing most women into the labor force, along with a shortage of housing and the legalization of free access to abortion? There's a very strong ponderance of views arising that these are the three explanatory factors of what one sees is happening in Poland, a very strong Catholic country. What had been happening earlier, of course, in Hungary. Romania has gotten so concerned about it, it's suddenly trying to pass laws on the other side and retreating. The Soviet Union has become concerned about the rapid decline of the net reproduction rates. But are these the three explanatory factors? I say worry about it, think about it, and see what insights we might get. In this country, there is just available on a study, a book sponsored by the National Academy of Science, Rapid Population Growth, which I think is the best balanced treatment on this question. I'm, of course, biased. I was on the committee originating this and have a paper in it. But the others are very good. And I really think it has a perspective that if anyone is really trying to get a feel of what perhaps is known with some courage and insights, I think there's something to be said for this book. Now, I must draw here to an end. Next is the unwanted children. The burden of having unwanted children is borne primarily by the woman. Shifting more of this burden onto the male is long overdue. What do I mean by this? For example, the thrust of biological research. I've been a trustee of the Population Council from virtually its inception, and I think I've seen the allocation research funds for human reproduction research leading into modern contraceptives, etc., the world over, firsthand. Several times a year, we've been spending 14, 15, more recent years, $1 million in these areas and so on, long before the government was willing to lend a hand. In fact, long before you even talked publicly in this in terms of the closed doors. It didn't really get closed until about the election time of Mr. Kennedy. The thrust of this research is still that reproduction is thinking, discoveries are hoped for with a view of getting better contraceptive methods that are female-oriented. This is true of the biological and related chemical research pertains to human fertility. And the fact that it has not really tried to place an equal amount of the burden of not having unwanted children on the male by contraceptive means is an odd twist, you see, that I think is inherent in what one observes in the way the research has gone and what is still essentially on the books. Now, you can argue this several different ways. But I think there is a point to what I'm trying to say. Now, since contraceptive methods are still far from perfect, an accelerated procedure to reduce the number of unwanted births is necessary. You may not share this view. Pugwash this summer, which I was participating in Romania, we came very strongly to this view in an international sense. Scientists largely who are not under government. And it was a pleasure being associated with it. The present president seems to be an extraordinary person, Mr. Alvin of Sweden, physicist, Nobel Prize. His is giving his life. He's particularly concerned about the population question, in a sense that it is not the doomsday kind of literature that I alluded to early in some things that go on in the United States. Now, this a procedure to offset mistakes, and yet it is simply a fact, except for a few scattered states, abortion in the United States is still illegal. I suggest that in this case, legalization or law determines fundamentally choices open to women are restricted largely by man-made laws. Now we come to the investment in human capital, woman. And I've already been talking about this a good deal as I've gone along the way. Let me call your attention to several things. You can't see it in terms of earnings in the labor market because only a smaller fraction of the total enter the labor market. There it shows up. This is as straightforward as males. Where does the reward to schooling show up in terms of the schooling and education of women? And what is coming up, particularly through our workshops at Chicago the last year, 2 years, and at Columbia, is the effect that this has essentially in the non-market activities in the household, tied in very much as I've been trying to argue in the efficiency of the woman, the value of her time, how things are allocated. Now there's some anomalies here, there's some puzzles. And one of these I'd like to just put on your mind. And if you really have a theory or the hypothesis that will unravel this puzzle, I'd be very grateful to you. Our data just keeps showing 3 different doctors' theses which we're not looking for. Out pops the fact in empirical analysis that the rise in the education of the wife increases the earnings of the husband, his salary, what he earns. Now, this seems illogical at first, or you have no logic for it as such. Let me say what I mean. You take a home, and you have a male who's 35 to 40 years of age, standardizing by age, you see. He's had 12 years of schooling, he's had 10 years of experience. And if you take the 1 in 1,000 sample of the United States total population, you then see those who are earning, these males, you see their salaries or their earnings, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000, so on. And then you take these same sets and you see the wives. They're married. And here she is. Those that come in the subset, they have wives that have 12 years of schooling. You get a figure, let's say this is, for one of these sets, 7,000. Now you hold everything at constant, and you get in that same thing, women that have 14 years of schooling, and the salary moves up on the male side. You get 16, it goes up much more. If the education of the wife drop below 12 to 9, 10, 8, and there's a drop in his earnings with the same qualifications, held very, very tight in these subsamples. It's just coming through all the time. Now what's happening? That's the puzzle. I must say, I'm quite convinced you can't shake the evidence. But I must say that it'll take somebody else's tuition than we've had. We have all sorts of notions of what's really going on here, but they don't take us very far. Let me leave it with you. Now, another that I think we have the answer to, this is the value of the woman's time, again, in this human capital sense, it turns out, is that if you watch the behavior of women when they get married, the normal pattern tends to be that they increasingly enter the labor market for a while before they have the children. Now we'll look at those who go into the labor market, and then you see this thing happening. When the children come, the woman with 16 years of schooling comes back in large proportion, leaves the labor market, and then devotes 10, 12 years or more to the family, to the home, and then re-enters the labor market. The girl, the homes of the woman is had 12 years of schooling, come back, but in much smaller proportion. even though they get a lower salary, or lower wage. Now you hold the income of these families, it's not an income matter because we've gone through this all with the incomes constant of the family. We've looked at those that have $10,000 income, for example. And then you see the female on the side here, where it's 16 years of schooling, 12 years of schooling, 8 years of schooling. Those with 8 years of schooling and 5 years of schooling come back least. Do not leave the labor market and give that full time, 10, 12 years to the home. Now, the reason this is human capital, we have now other evidence that shows that the value of the input of the woman with 16 years of school in the management of that home, what she gets out of consumption, what happens to the kids in the first 5 years as they get ready for school, is just vastly above the woman who has 8 years of schooling. This is in the mass of these aggregates, not any specific woman. It's thousands of women who have 5 to 8 years of schooling that I'm talking about, and thousands who have, many thousands who have 16 years of schooling. Now, I think here is, the evidence is very strong in supporting that the higher salary that the 16-year of education woman gives up is still less than the value of her time at that juncture, those 10, 12 years, in the home. As the earnings foregone, in other words, are valued less, are in fact less valuable. But this is not so true for the one who has 12 years of schooling and the one that has 8 or less years of schooling. Well, I could go on to some other issues here, but I think I shall not. But a very nice one when you think of a rural state with a rural history, of a long history, which I was somewhat aware of when I was here already, that farm-reared girls, leaving a declining sector of the economy, agriculture, moved out more sooner and more successfully than males. Now, there are quite a number of reasons you can think of why this is true, but the picture is straightforward. And the more successful the woman, again, rides on the level of her schooling. It does on the male, too, but the differences between the two prevail. And this one is straightforward, again, in terms of what's been invested in what I'm calling human capital. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I've taken my full measure of time from you, with great pleasure on my part, is this tremendous importance of seeing the rise in the value of the woman's time over time, which we've been living through. And this is the fundamental fact to which we're trying to adjust our institutions, our households, some marriage arrangements, the labor market. They all have to give. These are very powerful, persistent forces. They're not turning around. They're going to get stronger in moving the direction, not only absolute, but relative to the male. See. Now, I have a nice long section here, which I think is beautiful. Every sentence is precious to me. I rewrote it every time to be absolutely where I wanted it to come out. But I shall leave it at that. Now, my final plea is simply, can't we get more women to become really economists, top-flight economists, and bring their analytical equipment to bear to solve some of these unsettled issues? I think there are many of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scholz. As yesterday, you'll have an opportunity to choose from among this morning's speakers and the one after lunch for a concurrent session to pursue some of the points that may have been made during the morning and afternoon. We are at the break point. I think the announcements have largely been made. There is one note for those of you who are in the immediate geographic area. I understand that the talks given yesterday, or at least a major portion of them, are to be rebroadcast on Saturday morning over WI radio, perhaps around 9 o'clock. Eventually they will all be rebroadcast, but these will be coming up shortly. I think you know the groups that you belong to and therefore the areas to go to lunch. Don't forget, if you still want a ticket for tomorrow, to pick that up. The afternoon session begins at 1, and may I encourage you, after you've had lunch, if you're not allergic to our fall weather, step outside for a few minutes and sort of get revived.